If you've looked at any of the newer unit releases over the past few months, you'll know that it takes a lot for a unit to stand out these days. It especially doesn't help when newer units debut with nothing exclusive or remotely useful, which effectively dooms them from the offset. That's why IS tries to remedy it to some degree with inheritable weapons that everybody can use, with the exception that they're not all that amazing or weaker than what you'd probably get out of the average unit. However, sometimes an inheritable tends to exceed expectations to the point where they end up becoming comparable or even better than modern day PRF weapons at times. And throughout the 8 or so years of this game, we've had a great deal of them. And that's what leads us to today's video on the strongest inheritable weapons ever released. You'd think with how the game is these days that we never really had a good share of notable inheritable weapons, but there's actually been quite a lot, all things considered. And one of the weapon types that tends to get the bigger share of these is none other than lances. I would say lances have been treated as some of the best weapon types in the game just because there's always something lying around for them to use. Even if it's not nearly as top tier, it's still plenty usable, but every so often one would come out that's actually really good, even going as back as 2017 in Berkut's Lance, which funnily enough is not exclusive to Berkut. What made Berkut's Lance so good back in the day is that it gave you 7 res during your enemy phase, and you could refine it to give you extra res or any other stat as well as a bunch of extra HP, making it one of the better tanking lance options we had in the game. It made units like Effie really stand out because she had really good attack with middling bulk, but that helped offset it. People used Donald with it because he had a good amount of BST just lying around. It was just a generally good enemy phase lance. And on the opposite side of that, we had its Curtains, which gave you 2 pulses at the start of turn 1, which was really good for Gale Force strategies. Getting pulses on any unit these days is a lot easier, but way back when, it was just a lot more difficult, so having a weapon that could just give you 2 of that for free was really good. People would usually pair it up with their dancers like Azura because she could teleport in with Wings of Mercy, attack somebody that's a lot weaker, and then charge up a Gale Force and then dance. That was always a really good strategy. Navarre was also a really good Aetherades offense unit way back when he got his refund because he had a slaying weapon that gave him 2 pulses at the start of the turn. He was essentially just the PRF version of its Curtains, but any lance unit being able to do that was really solid. And going further into the Aetherade side of things, there was also Wagasa, which is a chill defense lance, which may not seem good these days, but it was one of the best things that you could throw on any Aetherade's defense at the time, especially on a dancer Eldigan who could be easily merged and defense stacked because it countered units like Mila, who was there to isolate any dancer. Eldigan was definitely the most notable unit of that kind just because he was easily mergeable, he was a dancer, and he had really high defense, so a lot of people just threw it on him for roll compression, and you didn't have to give up a B slot for it to really get going. It was just an easier Mila check past turn 1. That said, all these weapons came out at least 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. They are really old, but it is really nice to say that we do have an inheritable lance currently that is extremely strong, both in combat and support, in Johanna Lance. A lot of people are talking about it currently because it's not really that old. It only came out about, I think, 2 months ago, 2-3 months. It's not really that old. It gives you damage reflection at the start of the turn. It gives out attack and speed bonuses as well as dodge and null penalties during combat. It has a lot of support gimmicks built into it, and if you wanted to throw it on somebody for combat, you could probably get away with a lot of stuff. I personally did that too, and it does show its results from time to time. And this isn't even covering the plethora of other options that we did have, but these were definitely some of the most standout in their respective period of time, which is why I did want to mention them specifically. I also wanted to initially start with swords, but here's the thing. I think sword inheritables have been the weakest inheritables just throughout the entirety of the game, if we were to exclude colorless tomes, but considering those were introduced over 5 years later and only one at that until another 2 years later, I think it's fair to give them a bit more slack compared to a weapon type that's existed since the launch of the game. Even mentioning a sword feels like a stretch, but I think if there were any to mention that was actually fairly good, it would have to be Bellringer. At one point in time where the whole thing with infantry god builds were just stacking a bunch of speed and res and then dodge statuses, or even maybe no follow-up if you can afford it, having a weapon that just gave you healing per hit was actually pretty useful, even if it was just at 5. That said, it's definitely not on the same level as a lot of other stuff we had in the game, but for a tanking weapon, it was still okay because you could still refine it for another stat and you could get extra HP out of it. It was okay, but really there isn't anything that swords had that made them stand out quite like a lot of other lances or even axes. Axes also had a notable amount of stuff, even if they were just filler things. They still had more to offer than arguably any inheritable sword in the game thus far. And some of those standouts include Love Candelabra, which was a joint drive attack and defense weapon, and Acts of Devotion, which inflicted a bunch of free damage at the start of combat. Love Candelabra may not seem that good on the surface, but it was at a point in time where getting these types of stat swings for free wasn't exactly the most common thing, so even just throwing it on some sort of mythic for Aether offense was still a really good tool for stat stacking. But Love Candelabra also being brought up alongside Acts of Devotion makes it seem a lot worse than it really was, even though they are two different types of weapons. Just start of combat damage in general was one of the most broken things they've ever added to the game, until eventually they did nerf it with Breath of Life stuff and just pre-combat healing, which ultimately nerfed the weapon for good. I don't think there's ever going to be a point in time where this weapon actually works again, but at its peak, it was one of the dumbest skills we had, especially since it's stacked with other skills that gave you start of combat damage. So you could realistically get upwards of 40 for free if you were against a certain unit, which ultimately took most tanks and enemies to 1 HP a lot of the time. It was basically the most untankable weapon in the game. We also had a red tome equivalent to that, but I think that has its own separate mention, even though they are basically the same weapon. There were other weapons that stood out for sure, especially in the axe category, but there are several weapon types that could use it, which is why I wanted to put them in their own group, and that's mainly with blade tomes and plug-in weapons. Blade tomes were probably some of the earliest meta tomes we had in the entire game because it gave you a bunch of attack based on visible bonuses. It did slow down your special cooldown, but that didn't really matter when you could get 24 attack for free. It was especially really good on flyers because they could take advantage of stuff such as Hone Flyer and Fortify Flyer, and getting visible buffs all the way back in 2017 was really difficult, so having a C slot that could just give you 12 for free was really strong. And every single tome in the game could use it, but there were some that were just better than others just due to movement type. And even with a 24-point attack swing, it still couldn't save units like Odin because he had virtually no attack to leverage anyway, so it just made him a basic average unit, which I guess is still something, right? Either way, blade tomes were ridiculous back in the early days of Fae. You also had the plug-in weapons, which at one point in time, stat stick weapons were actually really good. Plug-in specifically doubled the amount of debuffs a foe had, so let's say the foe had 7 visible attack debuffed, that would become 14, and that could stack with other types of stats depending on which one you used, but it only worked with bows, axes, and green tomes. It was good enough to a point where you could realistically tank a lot of stuff if you just had a good amount of debuffs going for it, and it allowed units to hit pretty hard, all things considered. I don't think we've had another group of weapons that really were similar in this regard, which is why I wanted to separate these two specifically. Otherwise, you still had individual weapon types that had a good amount of stuff going for them, and I would say the only other weapon type that had just as much, if not more support than lances would be bows, as they've had some of the best inheritables to date. Bows had Fire Sweep Bow Plus, which was a really good Aether defense weapon for counter prevention against anybody just trying to enemy phase. There was no getting around it without null C disrupting your B slot, which was not the easiest thing to do or give up because there was so much opportunity cost. You had Spendthrift Bow, which was also another amazing stat ball weapon. It gave the unit 7 attack during combat and inflicted -7 attack on the foe, and it could still be refunded for any additional set and extra HP. It was just a really good stat ball weapon with a penalty that didn't really come up too often because of how much special manipulation there was. It's arguably a contender for one of the dumbest inheritables we've ever had in the game. You also had Whitecap Bow that gave you brave hits in the player phase if you can meet a speed check. This allowed a lot of bows to perform really well because 4 attacks ended up leveraging a lot of their output more so than basically any other bow they had at the time, especially for ranged flyers that didn't have good skill accessibility at the time. They were able to at least perform decently well in the player phase. And of course, there was also Golden Yule Bow, which can give you up to 3 special jumps either based on the amount of spaces moved or if the foe had a penalty, which allowed you to get instant dead eyes or any sort of special that you really wanted. And this was also at a point where a lot of units just had really good skill accessibility, so you could spam specials really easily with this weapon. It was a really good weapon when it came out, and I would argue it still has decent usage to this day, but stuff is still really competitive. That said, this weapon alongside all the other ones mentioned definitely left a mark on the game. And if we're talking about standout weaponry, which, you know, again, whole thing of the video, I didn't have a transition, moving on, Then Daggers absolutely need to mention for having arguably one of the best inheritables ever released in Broadleaf. Broadleaf Fan is sort of similar to Blade Tomes in the sense that you get a bunch of attack based on certain stat swings, but instead of having it based on your own visible stats, it was based on the debuffs of the foe, which were way more difficult to remove at one point in time, making them one of the best weapons for any sort of Vantage strategy back in Book 3. You could stack up a bunch of debuffs naturally because you can run smokes in your Sacred Seal and C slot. Daggers naturally debuffed by 7 points, which combined with the other smoke skills allowed you to get 28 attack for free, and there really wasn't anything in the way of stopping a unit from hitting you really hard with it, especially Matthew, who just had it in his refine. Even if the inheritable was better, it was naturally good enough for any sort of dagger to sweep an 8th rate's defense team. You did technically have counters and stuff with staff units that could get full sweep against any sort of these units, or Bronya, who released way later into the book, who neutralized penalties, but generally speaking, it was a really effective strategy for how little it took to get going. And similarly, on the debuff side of things, you had Tamari, which was a sabotage attack speed dagger that could also stack with your B slot. You could effectively debuff an entire opposing team with attack speed and then either defense and res depending on which one you throw on your B slot, just as long as you were able to meet a res check. It's what made units like Tethys really good, because not only could she debuff up to 3 stats really easily, because she also had a really high res stat, but she could also dance. People also threw it on their mythic air because it was also good roll compression, and you could just effectively get a lot of stat swings this way. It was a really good supportive weapon at the time. And if you're looking for a modern day support dagger, then you could just go to Johanna. I mentioned Johanna Lance earlier, and I wanted to keep this separate because I feel like Johanna was just a lot better when it came to damage output, just because you could take advantage of stuff like Excel and maybe Lagoo's Friend if you were infantry. There was a lot of better stuff that you could do as opposed to the dagger, but it's still a really good support weapon at the end of the day, and it still does decent amount of work if you do want to go into combat. Also, as a side tangent, there have definitely been times where I wish tomes could just share their weapons, because the difference in quality between them tends to be all over the place. This is especially true when one type of tome gets an extremely busted inheritable, and another typing is left to rot, although it's somewhat better these days at least. Before that, one of the biggest highlights for any inheritable tome besides the rare green tome instance was Devoured Basket. It's the same weapon as Axe of Devotion, except it's a red tome, although I would argue its potency was a lot stronger than the axe, and that's just because it was a ranged weapon. They give you more threat range on average. You could shut down a lot of far saves at a time where a lot of them were just already struggling to begin with, and even though they're both basically the same weapon, I would argue that Devoured Basket left a bigger impact since it monopolized basically every single red tome in the entire game. There were maybe 1 or 2 units that wanted to keep their weapons, even if they were just on the basis of maybe something like support or just having some sort of unique gimmick, but otherwise everybody was replacing their weapon for Devoured Basket because of how absurdly strong it was. Even the recently released Mythic and Kvasir didn't want to keep her weapon, which had way more effects in it, just because being able to chip off that much damage at the start of combat was so much more broken than anything she could have done on her own. It was that ridiculous to the point where they had to kill off the weapon in about 3 months or so with Breath of Life, but it cannot be understated how incredibly busted this weapon was at its peak. It basically made every single red tome unit one of the best nukes in the entire game. Even for units that had virtually no attack stat like Henry, he could take basically everything on. That's how you know it was really good. And at least compared to red tomes, we've never really had anything that was of that nature, even between blue and green. Green tomes, though, in my mind, were always the most gimmicky and inheritable, since they would always throw the most random stuff onto them at times. Sometimes they would do absolutely nothing, and other times they were actually really useful, even if it took a bit of time for them to age into that mold. Of course, a lot of them also share the same standard stuff like blade tomes as mentioned earlier, but they would occasionally get something different, and sometimes it would be really strong. One of those being Snow Globe Plus, which was an attack and res unity weapon, which was not really as good when it came out. It was a fine inheritable, but there really wasn't a whole lot that was taking advantage of the unity stuff per se. Not until the legendary male Robin meta hit back in book 7. This was at a point in time where just being a stat ball wasn't good enough, but he was not only a stat ball himself, he made every single unit into a stat ball, which for units that were also really good in combat as is, giving an extra layer of free unity and debuffs meant that they were going to be even more difficult to take out. And when combined with stuff that had additional unity built into their weapons, so this is where Snow Globe comes into play, you could get up to 3 layers of unity, which by some point, having that many stats was really good. And if you had extra extra utility on top of that, then it was just even better. It was still a weaker man's legendary Robin because you were essentially just making another version of that, but that was still pretty useful all things considered. And while not really a gimmicky weapon, Grand Raven was the only inheritable Raven tome that really took off for a good period of time. Red tomes and blue tomes also had this, but the reason why the green one was especially good was because of stuff like Brave Lane and Reinhardt back in the day. Raven tomes gave you effectiveness against colorless foes, which already was able to check stuff like Lin, but having that extra color against Reinhardt with a triangle advantage when it definitely mattered a lot more was really good for covering some of the best units in the game at one point. This was also paired up with the likes of Triangle Adept and Bowbreaker, meaning that you could realistically double Brave Lin with it, and you never really had to struggle against Reinhardt as long as you had good enough stats for it. Some of the most popular picks at one point were stuff like Cecilia, Performing Arts Inigo, and Nino. Cecilia had good threat range, Performing Arts Inigo was also a dancer, so he had extra utility, and Nino was an easily mergeable demo who also had the best stats out of basically any green tome at the time, if I remember correctly. It was just a really good combination for a lot of green tomes no matter what, so you could realistically get away with a lot of units using it, but these were by and far some of the most popular picks for it. That said, this was most definitely a byproduct of what color Reinhardt was. Lane, no matter what, was always going to be countered by a Raven tome, but if Reinhardt was any other color but blue, then the Raven of choice for the meta would have definitely been different. And while green tomes and red tomes have definitely had their standout weaponry, I don't think blue tomes really had something similar, but they did have a good inheritable weapon that gave it a fair amount of stats for tanking at a point in time where giving it that kind of stats wasn't really the easiest thing to do in Silver Goblet. It basically gave any unit 4 defense and res if attacked by a ranged unit, which was pretty useful. A lot of people would throw this on Peony, who was not only a mythic dancer, but it was also still good roll compression for the extra tanking drive effect. You could pair it up with other support units that also gave out a bunch of stats. It was a nice solid support weapon that, while not necessarily broken by any means, was still really solid in what it was setting out to do. And again, we didn't really have that kind of stat swing drive at that point in time where nowadays you could get a billion stats for free. It was still useful. And on the topic of supportive weapons, staff units have had a considerable amount of them throughout the entirety of Fae. Pain Plus is probably one of the most well-known ones because it inflicted 10 damage to the target in foes within 2 spaces, and it's stacked with Savage Blow and the C-Slot and Sacred Seal. It was effectively the earliest day of AoE damage because it inflicted 24 damage to everybody surrounding the target. It was very simple and effective, and that's why a lot of people used it. You also had the Gravity Staff, which restricted the target and any adjacent foe's movement to 1 movement, which was not only really good for hit and run stuff, but it also was really nice for Arena Assault back when armor meta was a thing. And of course, you also had Flash Plus, which inflicted a counter prevention penalty to any target and foe within 2 spaces of the target. It was a generally useful defensive tool that could shut down a lot of strategies in the enemy phase. You also had Grand Scratcher Plus, which gave an ally with the highest attack stat 1 pulse at the start of turn 1, which similarly to its curtains was also really good utility for Gale Force stuff, and you could also match attack stats so you could give it out to multiple allies if they both shared the highest attack stat. It's funny looking back on that banner because it was one of the most despised banners of all time, yet it had some of the strongest inheritable weapons ever released. You also had Palm Staff, which inflicted -5 attack and speed on any foe within 2 spaces. It didn't even necessarily have to be for the unit's own combat, it could benefit a lot of others, and if you stacked it up with a Staff Flyer who could also run attack, speed, rain, you were inflicting a lot of attack and speed penalties during combat. It was a really nice supportive weapon back in the Book 4 days. And of course, Tannin Baton, which I think is one of my personal favorite inheritable staffs, was a drive defense and res 2 weapon, and drive guard, which was really strong for Aether Raid's defense strategies. It not only gave everybody a bunch of extra bulk, but it also inflicted guard on anybody just trying to initiate combat, which meant that you could also shut off Gale Force strategies. Tannin Baton and Grand Scratcher especially were probably some of the best inheritable staffs that we've ever had in the game, but there are a surprising amount of inheritable staffs that have done a lot throughout the years. And other than that, there's really only one more weapon type worth mentioning, and it may ring familiar to many if they are around in the early 2018 days in Dragonstones, especially Lightning Breath Plus. Lightning Breath Plus slowed down your special cooldown count, but it did give you innate distant counter. It was okay at a period of time, but when they added the Refine update that allowed you to get extra stats and HP, then it really took off because this was after Brave Ike released, and Brave Ike was not good when he came out, but the best thing that he did introduce was Steady Breath. Steady Breath made it so that you could charge your special up way faster, and even with Lightning Breath slowing it down, you could realistically run Steady Breath in your A slot, Quick Riposte in the B slot, Aether in your special and whatever C slot after, and even though it's a 6 cooldown Aether, you could realistically get it off every single combat if the foe was doubling and you were doubling. It was a really strong tanking combination for basically every infantry dragon at that point in time, especially for units like Noe, who, if I remember correctly, was the most popular of the 3 dragons, just because she had a way better stat line. But realistically, you were able to use stuff like Tiki and Fae, and as long as you were able to get Aether procs out, which was basically the easiest thing to do at that point in time, you could also heal back whatever damage that you probably took, with the only caveat being it being dependent on the foe's current HP stat, because if they already took a hit and a considerable amount of it, then you probably weren't healing as much as you probably could, but it was really good at that point in time. The only other breath that could be worth mentioning is Surprise Breath, because it was a really good tanking breath at one point. It debuffed a bunch of attack and res and gave you attack and res during combat, so it was just a nice stat stick weapon at one point in time. Especially when Dual Leon was a really popular unit, people threw it on their Valentine's Mar, who also at the time was still relatively good, just so that they can meet a res check and not instantly lose against him. But really, Lightning Breath Plus is the biggest highlight for any Dragonstone, and overall, there have been a lot of really strong weapons throughout the years, some definitely ranging in strength for sure, but you may be wondering which weapon was the strongest between everything listed here. While keeping it all relative, I believe it's between Devoured Basket, Spendthrift Bow, and Broadleaf Fan. All 3 of these weapons did a lot respective to their time, and more often than not was the go-to weapon for most units in their archetype just because of how strong they were. As previously mentioned, Devoured Basket was the epitome of a nuking for any red tome unit. Spendthrift was a great stat ball weapon at a time where that kind of stat swing was not common, and Broadleaf Fan allowed basically any dagger unit to gain an absurd stat swing consistently. At least of these 3, Devoured Basket is my personal favorite, but I think there's arguments to be made for the other 2 as well. That said, what would you say is the best Inheritable ever released into the game? It doesn't even have to be from anything listed here, and do you think there were some other Inheritables that should have been mentioned in this video? Let me know down below, and if you want to see more videos like this, then make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you later.